Purtuna Shengevulu, Purtuna Shengevulu, Nena Momchimevulu, Nena Momchimevulu.
Hebozos kanisheni, hebozos kanisheni, banda chverigovulu, banda chverigovulu.
Rakanis modgeladgir, Rakanis modgeladgir, Limjishi chwala chwala, Limjishi chwala chwala.
Mochtim en dagiona, mochtim en dagiona, mulunachki mikala, mulunachki mikala.
Varvego jane bici, Varvego jane bici, Varmales canicala, Varmales canicala.
Ubasmu molagizin, ubasmu molagizin, muchom zogas quanchala.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Okay. What shall we say? The video you're about to watch, I did a really stupid thing. Really, really stupid. I recorded all the video. I also had my little sound recorder on. Took everything off the little discs on the side of my laptop. And then put the whole thing into the garbage and completely deleted it all. So, as a result, I have been desperately trying to save, going into the computer and trying to get what I can through a data recovery tool. And I did manage to save some. But some of it was super glitchy. And I couldn't save it all. So this is going to be an experiment in collage where the truth is, fortunately for this particular video, you don't need to really watch it. You can listen to the whole thing. And I did have the sound all saved, and I've synced up more or less the sound with the video. And there are big blank spots throughout, to which I will simply be adding, I don't know, various kinds of visual entertainment for you. I haven't done it yet. I'm still thinking about it. It might be just forest sites or, images of people walking down the street. In other words, you can just listen to this whole thing and really not have to watch much of it. Except the point where I show you my kumquat tree. When you hear the word kumquat, you need to kumquat back to watch the video and look at my little kumquat tree that I put in my window. Okay, enjoy. Sorry for my stupidity. I have a saying. Whenever I do something stupid, here's my saying that I say to myself. I have done stupid things in the past. I will do them again. Stupid is not malevolent. Stupid is like locking yourself out of your car. Stupid is breaking dishes in the kitchen. That's stupid stuff. Interestingly enough, though, sometimes stupid stuff ends up being super important. But good thing for you. See, I could have done the whole thing over again. But I was on a roll, and I didn't have any notes I was going from. I was just talking about community. So, let's start this video somehow, shall we? Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Burn Power, coming to you from a very sunny day here in Tbilisi, Georgia. I thought I would take advantage of the sun this morning to get some strong, bright shadows, a little chiaroscuro. But what we're going to do today, I just had this thought in my mind, and I'm going to talk
extemporaneously about the subject of communities, communes, things like this, because I realize I've had quite a bit of experience in these things, without planning for it, by the way, just through my life experience. So I thought I would just talk about it. And I can talk about it extemporaneously because I can just kind of go through the history of my experiences, and that will form its own sort of cohesion. And before we get on, I would like to remind everyone, subscribe. It can't hurt. and evidently subscribing and liking and interactions all help the algorithmic deities to point people to this video in the future. I'm almost at 2,000. I might be at 2,000 subscribers by the time you watch this. Should I do something special? What do you think? Let me know if you think I should do something special when I hit 2,000. 2,000, I hit 1,000, I did something then. 2,000, yeah, it's a number. I don't think I'll do 3,000 or 4,000. They're just not the right numbers. But 5,000 certainly would be. But still, by YouTube standards, well, it's better than a small channel just getting off the ground. But it's not particularly big at all. It's, there's a couple thousand people who will spend time, not all at once, listening to me. I do notice that certain kinds of videos get, the big hits. So my next How We Got Here, circling around now, we'll pick up all the 2,000 people and then some. The Jonathan Peugeot interview I did got, 8,000 or 9,000 views right now. My biggest seller. I'm not making any extra money on that. Because I don't make money on YouTube because I live in Georgia and I have to be in America to get the thing they send in the mail, whatever that is. I don't know. I haven't received mail for ages because I live in Georgia. In order to take it to my bank, who is not here. So I can't sign up for the AdSense stuff. So if you want to help out, link below. You can also get some free goodies if you give over, $50 in one whack or $10 a month. I'll send you some extra audio material. But you can share these videos as well. I don't imagine you'd want to share all of them, but there are videos here that have, what can we say, special interest for different people. And if you suspect one of those videos is up that alley, do it. Also, coming very soon, maybe a day or two after this one, will be a video called, 10 Obscure Songs About Courage. And I've had way too much fun making that. It's also been a lot of work, but just wait for that one. That'll be very different. But following on from last week's discussion on how to revive culture, one of the most important things is the need for community. Now, what is a community? And you can tell we're in trouble because the very word community has practically lost all of its meaning. And what do I mean? Well, I remember a few years back, many years back, I started hearing things like the black community, the gay community. Nowadays, the feminist community. Nowadays you hear things like the trans community, but then you hear online talk about this community or that community, the MCU community, the Star Wars community, or shall we say fandom. And none of these are communities. We use this word to mean a lot of people who are interested supposedly in the same thing, but you can see it as soon as you look at something like the black community. Well, does that include Nigerians, or is it just in America? Are all Americans who are of African ancestry in the United States on the same page? No, There are conservatives. There are people who don't pay attention at all to what's going on in their community. It's this big amorphous term, and I don't like using it. Every now and then I might use it just because it's a way to communicate something, but I don't like using it. I much prefer, I certainly don't like the word fandom either. That's another subject for another day. But I find what they do is they do not address what a community addresses. So, what is a community? For me, a community has to be a group of people who occupy many different, overlapping, intersecting positions. You can have small communities. You can certainly have a local church community. But can you have a Southern Baptist community or a Roman Catholic community or an Orthodox community? They're too big to be a community. You can have a local church community because within that body you have people holding different positions making up one group. And the Bible often speaks about when people get together, how is it we all have different aspects, different groups, different meanings within the community. I think there's also the sense of the community of a place that has, what shall we say, a small town might have a community. I lived in Haines, Alaska, and Haines, Alaska, the entire Chilkat Valley had about 2,500 people in it. And that was, I would say, almost a community. I say almost because there were different parts geographically, for one thing. And I think geography plays a much bigger role than we tend to think. And that's one thing I've learned over time, is that geography plays a very strong role. And for instance, people who live in a large city and travel a half hour to an hour from one end of the city to the other in order to attend their favorite church or support group or whatever, the geography on that is really weak. And I think without the geography, the community is not in trouble. This is another reason why I think online communities aren't really communities at all. Because without the geographic component, you're missing one of the key factors. That we are all in this together. It's much harder to help someone who isn't geographically near you. It can be done. I've had people help me through crowdfunding who aren't at all anywhere near me. But it's not the same. It's not the same as someone who knocks on your door and says, "Bern, are you okay? Bern, are you there? Bern, can we talk?" That kind of thing. So I think geography plays a big role. So a small town can be a community, but, huge but in our time today, technology has divided us. So you could have a group of people in the same geographic vicinity today who are all staring at their iPhones. Are they in community? No. If everyone's sitting at home watching television, are they in community? Not very strongly, that's for sure. What else should we say? There are things that pull us apart. The car, the automobile, pulls us apart. That's one of the things we can be sure of. It does not bring people together. It gives you individual freedom. And here's the thing. In the West, our individual freedom is absolutely wreaking havoc with any sense of community. And so since the 1960s, since the hippie era, there has been a lot of talk about communities, intentional communities. You often hear these words. Someone will slap the word intentional on the word community and then say, we should form one. And my feeling is that there has to be something somewhat organic to the community. So it can't simply be people living together in a commune, and we'll discuss that in a moment. But one of the things that's absolutely true is that for the vast majority of people living in Western society, even people living in small towns, there is no community left, or very little. I would say in Alaska, in the small town of Haines I lived in, there was not too much community left. There was enough, though, much more so than when I lived in New York City. Much more so even than here in Tbilisi, although here we have you can find a sense of community. But we'll come to that. So, we live in a world where we have individual freedoms. We live in a world where we have... Our freedoms allow us to consume the media we wish to consume. It allows us to be ourselves, the sacred goal of the sacred self. But it disconnects us from others. I just watched some YouTuber, whom I won't mention the name of, but she was saying she was trying to do travel videos and tell other people's stories. But of course, she was just, hopping into different places and hopping out. So she said she's going to tell the only story she really knows, which of course you could hear this coming a mile away. It just is herself. Is that the only story you know? To tell the other stories, you need to spend time and commitment to people within your geographic location. Much as I love my friends who are not present with me, I can't tell their stories right now. I can tell snippets of them, but I don't know what their daily life is like. And without the daily life, you don't really know certain aspects of who that person is. Even if you've spent time with them in the past tends to then put distance between you, and geography comes back to quote the name of Robert D. Kaplan's book, where he was talking about geopolitics and how we hadn't reached the end of history because there was the revenge of geography, which is what we're seeing play out in Ukraine right now. It is that geographic plane, which has no natural borders, which we are seeing take its revenge. Where is the border here? So Russia thinks that's really all our territory because there's nothing that states, like a mountain range, that's our territory. That it isn't our territory. So when I grew up, I was born in 1955, and by the time I was 10, I was in California, 1965. That world I grew up in, suburban California, north of San Francisco, and San Rafael, California. The community was already pretty atomized by that time. For one thing, size tends to work against it. For another thing, what should we say? The geography, again, you would expect that there would be certain neighborhoods. But one of the things that works against neighborhoods these days becoming communities the way they used to be is the ease of moving into and out of a neighborhood. And this is why transportation with automobiles has been really damaging for communities, because it means you can just get up, pack up, and go. Another thing that's been damaging is sending your kids off to school. One of the things I think we are seeing in the woke world is the chickens coming home to roost on the concept of sending your kids off to university. Because what happens is they don't anymore necessarily go off and learn a bunch of stuff. Is they go off and become indoctrinated into the way University students are supposed to see things. So they might live in a small community, go to university, and learn that everybody is actually racist all the time. And their common sense won't tell them anything different, because once you put those goggles on, and they're very thick goggles, you've tarred everything you see with this, petroleum Vaseline on your lenses. But this was true even when I was young. And so I didn't grow up in that much of a community. Most of the community life in America really started to take a serious hit after World War II. And the reason it did was because of all the new suburbs and the highways that had been built. And so what goes on with the suburbs is that you build these suburbs. Now, the original suburbs from, we'll say, the beginning of the 20th century in America were built near the city. But eventually what happens is you build the newer suburbs further and further out. You can see this in Los Angeles, which isn't so much a city as it is a string of suburbs. And when the suburbs get old, the clientele changes. And so poorer people move in. Then you have problems. So the other people move to other suburbs, which tend to be further out. Eventually you start moving into gated communities. At this point, what are we talking about? So it was when I was about 13 years old that the hippie world exploded in the San Francisco Bay Area. And suddenly there was this idea of getting back to the land, of forming communes. These ideas had been around for a while. Some people were indeed looking to the Mennonite, Amish, Hutterite communities, and they're pulling a little bit, like the Bruderhof in New York State, and thinking about it. But of course, what had happened in the hippie era was these new communes were about religion, the new religion of psychedelics, meditation in the Eastern sense, not the Western sense. Of many of them had extremely lax sexual ethics, to say the least. Some of them held orgies. They were hives of this new idea. Some of them matured and grew up and learned we have to work together and that sort of thing. These communities, some of them became cults. There were psychological cults of people who all lived together practicing, of course there was, in California there was one Synanon, which was a psychotherapy cult, which ended up living together. And I remember the day in the early 1970s when the leader had to get his head shaved. It might have been cancer treatment. So all the other followers of this psychotherapy cult, Synanon, shaved their heads. And so it was really bizarre. You could tell instantly now who was a member of this cult walking through a town like Petaluma, California. You see these two people there and they got shaved heads and they're women. And you go like, oh, okay, they're in the Synanon cult. These communes often bred a kind of cultishness because you had all these people together. There was the Rajneeshi cult, which was big in the 1980s. And lots of squirrely stuff went on there, as well as the reaction to it from the outsiders in the community, who were dead set against all this cultishness. I became a Christian in 1970 through the Jesus movement. I was 15 years old. I was in high school. And we won't go into all the whys and wherefores. We'll just say this. At the age of 15, suddenly I realized life had meaning. Prior to that, it didn't, because, child of divorce, alcoholic stepfather, weak mother, didn't provide a lot of meaning or security in this world. So I became a Christian. At the age of 17, I graduated school. Fortunately, I had okay grades. That was one thing that changed, is my grades went from being absolutely abysmal, getting D's and even an F in classes, to being very good. I had almost straight A's by the end. And the only thing that really changed wasn't my study habits. it was the sense that I saw that there was meaning in the world and that one should study to understand things in order to show compassion and to discuss things with other people. So afterwards, now one of the things we had in our group was we had communes. Now these were, in a sense, a Christian response to what had been going on in the hippie world. And that Christian response involved, I would say, sometimes a little bit too much of an imitation of what was going on in the secular communes, in the sense that we were in one location. We often had a farm. We had a couple of farms during our time. We ended up, what was it? We started off, there was Zion's Inn, which was a commune just for girls, and then there was Baraka House, which was originally a commune just for guys. Not a bad idea, separating the men and women, by the way. And then, eventually Baraka House would allow families and women as well. And they moved to a bigger place up on Magnolia Avenue in Petaluma. And then there was another larger farm. We went from 2 or 3 acres, I think, maybe 6 acres on Magnolia Avenue, to then there was Thyatira House, which was on Spring Hill Road, which had, I think, 17 acres and a Christmas tree farm, which I was instrumental in convincing them that, you know what, we don't do this business. Let the trees grow. And so for a long time, I would drive by there afterwards and see my trees because they were growing and growing. But that's not related to the story, but it's kind of an interesting detail. But we had several houses on that property. I think things have changed quite a bit there by this time, but because there's no more Thyatira House, I believe. But we had a couple of houses on that property. But one of the things I learned was how difficult it was. And I forgot to mention, in 1973, I graduated early and went to live at the commune on Magnolia Avenue in Petaluma called Baraka House. And it was down out away from the town, then down a dirt road, passing a couple of dirt road cutoffs, and then finally you would arrive at Baraka House. And Baraka House was 1 2-story house, and the second story was just basically an attic with, A-frame on top of it. We had a barn. We had some garage-type space. We had a couple of little shacks. Now, I remember before I moved there, in 1971, going out there, one summer there was something like, I want to say 31 people at one time, but it was well over 20. 23 maybe on average. For the whole summer, there was just tons of people. There were 2, different people living in the shacks. I think someone slept in the attic of the barn now and then. And then we had, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8 beds upstairs in the attic. And then we had, I think, a bedroom or 2 downstairs. And there would be people sleeping on the couch now and then. And occasionally people would sleep in a tent out in the field. I mean, it got to be insane, with lots of cars kind of like left there as debris. I remember burying one of them as a job. And we would have jobs. And I was there in 1971, I didn't move there. That was 1973. But I was there for a couple of weeks as a visiting teenager because, it was cool. But it was also, I was learning quite a bit since I would be talking with these older people, most of whom had been refugees from the deluge into San Francisco because of the hippie movement. And so I heard from most of the people who came, they were desperate. The reason they were there is because San Francisco had become a pit by that time. Full of people living on the streets, lots of abortions, endless drugs, drug addiction. And these people came there looking for, the summer of love. Well, they came maybe a year or too late in many cases. And instead what they found was more alienation. That hippie dream did not work. And because one of the problems is if everyone's taking drugs and getting stoned, getting high, acting like children. You see these pictures from particularly 1967 of these people like dancing in the streets or in Golden Gate Park. Well, if they're all acting like children, where are the adults? And I'll tell you, to run a home, to run a physical structure requires adults. You cannot do it as a teenager. You cannot do it as a child. You have to be an adult to do things like pay mortgages, pay rents, keep the water bills up, the repairs on the house, all of this. And when I moved into Baraka House in January of 73, I was one of 4 people left there. And we had and I think I've told this story before, but we had an ex-con who was living there, and he had seduced quite a few of the people into basically, there were probably another 4 or 5, 6 people there at the time, but he had seduced many of them into drugs again, into sexual promiscuity again, and all of this. And we had to get people from our other communes and the pastor who kind of oversaw the thing to get this guy out. And then he had taken revenge on us by unplugging the large freezer we had outdoors that kept we had pigs that we slaughtered, goat meat, rabbits, all of this stuff, and it ruined all of our meat for us. And then he had threatened to firebomb the place. So when I moved in, we had chicken wire fencing on the windows to prevent anything from coming through. And we had almost no food, and because there was no one there working hardly, except for I think one person may have had an actual job, and yet there were still rents to pay. I remember we had Campbell's soup cans in this one shack, and they were all unlabeled, unmarked, and so we would have to. And for one meal during the day, I think we had 2 meals a day, and one was breakfast with like oatmeal or cornmeal, and hardly any eggs. And we were building our chickens up again, but still, a lot had been destroyed. And then the other meal was you got your pick of 2 cans of these. Someone had given us from a local grocery store, huge pile of unmarked cans where the labels had fallen off. And so I remember shaking these things, going like, and you'd want the ones that didn't sound like watery, because that would be like cream of mushroom soup or cream cheese, kind of a cream cheese soup, cheddar soup. But you didn't want the super watery ones, because you might just get chicken broth with nothing but water in it, essentially, and some chicken flavor. But you can see there was a problem with the communal structure. And I noticed many things. One of the things that happened after that, and I've gone into this in detail in other places. I think my biographical Q&A, I talked about this. And also, I may have talked about some of these things with Sam on the interview I did with him, which you can find on either his channel or on my channel in the Conversations playlist. One of the things I learned, one of the things that happened immediately after that was our rules started to escalate, because the question was, how do you prevent the fox from getting into the chicken coop? How do you prevent the villains from getting into the world you've created? Now, we weren't there the way a lot of Christians since then have wanted to form communities, which is to say, we weren't there for protection as much as we were there for communion, to be together. And I would say there's a very big difference between a community of protection and a community, I'd like to say it was more a community of celebration or a community of togetherness on some level. And we had one of the things I really appreciated from this time was the diverse characters that we had within our communal structures. And, just a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds, ranging from a guy who is a scientist named Gary Poovey, who is just a wonderful guy, taught me a lot about how to appreciate the world around us. And I remember once driving with him someplace, and we got outside and looked at the stars, and he would just say, there's Alpha Centauri, and if you look really carefully, you can see with your naked eye the great spiral of Andromeda, these sorts of things. And then you get people who, like I said before, who had actual experience of coming to San Francisco during the hippie period. And if you listen to enough of those stories, you would never, ever romanticize that era again. And then there was people who'd come from different parts of the country, who have different kinds of backgrounds, different kinds of Christians. Some people who weren't Christians, but most of them were in some sense. There was one guy's story, a guy named Bob Martinez, who hung around for well over a year, maybe 2 years, always played the fool, always acted. I remember once he said, he sat with his guitar in a Bible study and said, I have a song we'd like to share. And one of the things that was really great was I developed my own musical sense, not by listening to music, which I'd already done prior to my Christian days as an early teenager, but by playing for each other and with each other. And so one of the great things about these communes was we would sit around and play music together. Now that is something missing from most communal structures that I've ever heard since then, is the idea of a shared culture. And we weren't even thinking about it. We just did it. We had different people who, it's like if 3 people arrived and they had guitars, they'd just sit and be playing, and eventually they'd be singing with everyone and for everyone, depending on whether it was a song to be sung to people or a song to be sung with people. Anyway, this guy Bob Martinez, talking about strange characters, gets up and says, I have a song I'd like to sing. So he's sitting there and he plays a song, and what he's found is like the most salacious chapter out of Ezekiel, filled with horrors and just strange judgment of God and nudity and all this other stuff. And he sings this. And at that point, I think some of us were saying, who is this guy? And it turned out later, the mask he'd been wearing started to slip. And he had been kind of walking around spaced all the time. And he'd eat like, just like someone backs a dump truck up and go into his mouth. He was always hungry all the time, but never gained weight or anything. Definitely hippie debris. That is to say, someone who came to California, or actually from Southern California to Northern California. But what happened was one day it kind of cracked, and we were talking with him, and we said, Bob, you're not really a Christian, are you? And he goes, no, not really. And he says, and we say, Bob, so have you been faking it for the last 2 years here? And he goes like, and suddenly his personality changes, and he just goes, yeah, I just thought it was a way to, I liked you people, and it was a way to get food. But that's what you learned being in Christian communes, and plus a whole lot more. I mean, I'm just barely scraping the surface of the water here. So it was a fascinating time. But here are some of the lessons I learned about communes. First of all, and this is during this period, you cannot have 2 families under the same roof. And by this I mean if you have a married couple and a married couple, or whatever, however you're going to divide it, 2 couples, they can't be under the same roof. Not for long. I mean, you can put them under there for emergency situation, but eventually what's going to happen is each one is a pole on its own, and they're going to come into collision. And I saw that many times. And this is one of the central problems, I think, of the communes of the late 60s and into the 70s in California, is that, now some of the people solved this in the secular communes, the hippie communes, by having these open marriage kind of things where we're all sleeping together. But even that would eventually break down because there was someone that people didn't want to sleep with, But in our communes, where we didn't have that sort of problem, the issue became more one of, you just have too many poles. And eventually, these couples would start to have tension. And it's just a natural thing. And I don't think there's much of a way around it. And especially if there are any children involved. Once you get that, because who takes care of the children? And how do they take care of the children? That's one problem. Another problem is, who does the chores? And what happens if a person doesn't do their chores? These kinds of questions. These sound like really practical. Yeah, but we love each other. No, you won't. Because there's always, for instance, going to be someone who wants a free ride. It's just human nature. If 7 people are doing work, there'll be one of the 7 who'll be doing a lot less work. And not because they're the leader, but because they just have found ways to kind of hang out on the peripheries, kind of watch as the ditches get dug and the dishes get washed, how to avoid work. And that ends up pulling things apart. One of the reasons we had to form more rules, was to try to deal with what was going on in our communes and how they were, that people would be involved. Now, there's a whole other aspect of sexual relationships within these communes. That's a little bit outside of the zone I want to get into right now, but nevertheless, that is an issue. And our answer to that problem is, well, make sure they're in separate communes. Eventually, we started having more, shall we say, co-ed communes. But still, there were these issues. It's better to go to someone else's house to see someone than to have them in the same place if they're not married. And of course, this doesn't make sense to people today, because today people just hook up, whatever that means. I mean, are you freight trains? You got your semi-tractor, connecting before you take your rig on the road. What does it mean to hook up? I mean, talk about inhuman sounding words. But that is the level of humanity today. People are, people wouldn't understand what I'm even talking about, because we had the idea that one waits until marriage. Do you understand what I'm saying? And then there was the problem, the biggest problem was that we started to form groupthink. And I'd put it this way, at the beginning of our Jesus People days, there was more diversity of opinion than there would be by, say, 1975. And not only was there diversity of opinion, there was now strictures for dealing with people's problems. Now, in any situation, you have to have rules about what happens. What do you do if you have, like I explained before, a fox in the hen house? Someone who's genuinely a predator, and they do exist. Anyone who tells me well, everyone's basically good, but there's a lot of ignorance, and if you could just teach them. No, there are some people who aren't genuinely good, and they may have, as Solzhenitsyn says, footholds of goodness left in them. But much of their motives will be entirely selfish and predatory. I really saw this in New York City, but it's the same with the guy who wanted to firebomb us. By about 75, 76, we had taken on a lot of very cultish aspects related to the discipline problems. And I've gone into this in detail in other places. But that is one of the biggest problems with communal life, is the that. Either that, the opposite is, and I saw this, I went to a different city to live for a while before I eventually went to L'Abri. And there they had the opposite problem. There, nobody was connected. There they were all, no matter their age, they were like university students living in a dorm who have no connection to each other and just kind of share the same place and rent. And, the only actual connection they have is, okay, here's my money for the electricity. Here's my money for the water. Here's my money for the rent. That kind of thing. Yeah, and there's a list, that you clean up now, you clean up then. Which I would say it became more the rule, particularly in universities after that. In universities, it seemed like human contact just severely dropped. And it just became, you can't criticize anyone after a while. Unless they have the wrong ideas. So, I eventually went to L'Abri in Switzerland. Now, what I saw at L'Abri in Switzerland was radically different. It was kind of a commune, but in a very different manner. And in my way of thinking, it had many improvements over what I saw and still forms a great chunk of what I see as the good possibilities of forming a community. So here's the thing. So back in California, we had 2 farm communes in Petaluma, one in Rohnert Park. We had one in Novato, California, which if you know this area, that's about 10 miles away. Then another about 10 miles away in San Rafael, California, maybe 2 there. And there were others as well. Now, what you're seeing there is a complete breakdown of geography. And so there wasn't really, what happened over time was also, well, eventually there was a church that went with it that was called the Church of the Open Door. I think they had to change their name eventually because of, for legal reasons, there was already a Church of the Open Door in California. But also they became bigger. I think we went up to well over 1,000 people, 1,500 or so. It got to be sizable, another independent church. I would say they eventually shuffled off the cultish aspects. But now you're dealing with the problems most churches deal with. And many churches are no longer communities, but rather people who have the same faith, who live in radically different parts of town. And it does not make for good community. Also, in church communities, what you find is actually the communities are often run by a few people. We're talking here Protestant, Reform-based, democratic churches, you might say. They're often run by a few people who are on the board of elders, more so than the pastors. Some of them are more run by the ministers, the pastors, some independent churches, but in many Reformed type style churches, they're run by this board of elders. And the board of elders often, I can talk about one church I became quite familiar with that had a couple of people in the church who just always remained in the positions of treasurer and secretary. And those people were the people, they would not allow any changes. So that you might have other people and deacons and all the rest of it in the church who might want something to change. But these people were holding certain positions and held a certain kind of, I don't want to go so far as say as ideology, but as much as say proclivities towards a certain kind of life, which usually did not include understanding young people at all. And this is one of the problems that I think infects a lot of churches, that you have these people with gray hair who get themselves ensconced in power, but what they don't get ensconced in is any sort of understanding of the way the culture is changing. So what was good enough in the past is good enough for now. And the problem with that is, well, you might as well be living on Mars. You're living in this world that doesn't relate to the people outside of your doorstep. And I saw this in New York City. For a while, I went to an Episcopalian church before I realized it was hopeless. But I was right at a point where the church, it was a pretty good church. They were proud of themselves for having a homeless mission. Meanwhile, they were in downtown New York City, and outside were all these people who were punks and alternative scenesters and artists and whatnot. What we would eventually call hipsters, but I would say a radically different mindset from today's hipsters, who are much more ironic. And they had no connection to these people, nor could they speak into them, because they had already made certain concessions to modernity, which did not allow them to speak. And so this is another aspect of communal life, which we had a problem with this in our church, in our commune and church, and other churches have this problem. And that is that after a while, your community simply becomes inside the walls of the church. And what's going outside of you doesn't really matter, except when it's a big deal. And then you're talking politics, which is lethal. Politics are always lethal. So what it is, so to get back to L'Abri, the thing about L'Abri was that they were not an inward-focused group. And there were certain rules. For instance, someone would come there as a student. And as a student, you would work half a day and you would study half a day. And there were a couple of days off during the week. And your study was determined by a combination of factors. One was what you were hoping to study, and two, by what your tutor felt like, well, really, maybe you should look into this since you're having this problem. And so those two things together would guide you. Work would be work around the various buildings of L'Abri, which could include gardening. It could include, what shall we say? It could include rearranging the furniture or cleaning up. Could include lots of dishes that were done by everyone and weren't part of the daily task of any of the students necessarily. But going down, doing the winter cleanup, shoveling snow to keep people from tripping. All of these things might be a part of the work. And I remember this in 1978, being sent to someone's house in the community, in the little village of Waymo, which had under 500 people, I believe, at that time, and doing someone in the community a favor. So I remember going into this. This is one of the first days that I did anything as a student at L'Abri. I was in Waymo before being sent over to France, to French L'Abri. And I was sent into this old woman's chalet. We moved all her furniture, then unrolled her rug, took it outside, unfurled it with the top side upside down, and then beat it so that all the dust went into the snow. And I thought, wow, this is really a great way of cleaning a rug. And beating it, everything goes into the snow. We lift it off. It looks like brand new. Take it back into her house after letting it dry a bit, although it wasn't really wet because the snow wasn't wet. Take it back in and eventually move the furniture back. That was really interesting to me. Now, we did a little bit of that in our Petaluma communes in California. That is to say, we would go to people's houses and do favors for them. We would also work outside in California. We had our own lawn mowing business, carpentry business. I remember 1971, we went out and took down an old redwood chicken coop. I want to sneeze just thinking about it. It was just so full. And in fact, I did sneeze a lot, and I developed allergies as a result of that. Prior to my life, I'd never had allergies before. But all that chicken dust and the chicken manure in the sawdust and all the rest of it, and the fact that there was hay season, there was May, and there was pollen everywhere, I was dying. But we did go out into the community, but not with as much intention, I would say. And one of the things I noticed about L'Abri right away was that there was the idea that we should interact with the larger village, that we shouldn't simply be off to ourselves. Now, at different times, that would change, depending on the relationship of L'Abri to the community. But there were always people at L'Abri who fostered some sort of relationship to the people in the community. Now, this would change a bit as the actual village changed, and as the older folks would die off, and then the younger folks are saying, why am I living in this little village in the Alps where there's, I love this, people always say, nothing to do, nothing's going on here. So they would leave. Well, then, as transportation got more effective, people would say, oh, but it would be great to have a little house in a little village and then drive down into the valley to work in Aigle or Lausanne or even Geneva, which is, quite a drive. So some people would be second homes, other people would be their bedroom community home, and that changed the nature of the community. That always does. But my feeling was that what you had was more of an outreach to the community, partly to help them to understand what the heck all these students were doing. Who were these people? And one of the things about L'Abri is they didn't get one kind of person. They got a lot of kinds of persons. It would be different every year. And in my visiting, I think I've been there about 8 or 9 times, visiting and popping in at different times and often giving lectures, I would notice radical differences in students. And they just had different emphasis and different kinds of questions, different things they were looking for. And sometimes were better than others, quite frankly. And some of the student groups were more rebellious than others. And some, I remember one year was just, we seemed to get all the woke students. And that was a nightmare because they were starting to use words like his, might as well be cis heteronormativity. As one of the first people to call me cis was there at L'Abri, and I was just like, what the heck? Don't you dare. I got peeved at that because it's just like, don't label me like that. You have no idea what you're talking about. Just ixnay on the atche, don't do it. But that was one thing I saw at L'Abri, was that it was outward focused. But here's the primary thing. It wasn't just outward focused in terms of the local community. It was also outward focused in terms of the world. And I think this is where a lot of communes break down. Let me explain how. Well, let me talk about how the communal situation. See, like I mentioned, there are communes of protection. And in Alaska, I knew Christians who were really desperate to protect their kids from, public school. And I certainly understand that, because public school has turned into, just a place where it's just totally controlled by the curriculum. The curriculum is invented by people somewhere off the stage who have ideologies you really don't want to give in to. So I knew Christians in Alaska who were doing all they could to stay away from those ideologies. But as good as that was as a noble idea, and I must give them credit because they saw me as someone who could talk to their children and talk about the world. And sometimes I talked about things that, they're painful or they're confusing. But I felt like it's better for me to do that than to shelter them. And so I considered myself, to the degree possible. I don't know if it was possible because there were other factors involved. One of those other factors was the internet. But in Alaska, I saw people who were so concerned with protecting themselves. And many communes and communities of Christians have been formed to protect themselves. And communes of protection form a problem. And I can understand why. The world's a dark place. You don't want to lose your children. But as Hans Ruckmacher once said, He says, like, that's the way to having a joyless Christianity. Because he says, you take your children and you quarantine them off and you protect them from all the things in the world. Don't let them watch this channel. Don't let them go on the internet. Don't let them watch these kind of movies. Don't let them listen to this kind of music. And you're not actually helping to make someone who will fit into this world. You're helping to make someone who is essentially a hothouse plant, which is fine as long as you live in the hothouse. But once you get out into the big world, and I can attest this as someone who's been in the big world, there are things far stronger than you realize. And if you have no grit, no guts, no intestinal fortitude, if you don't have some sort of antidote to this, if you haven't dealt with the subject, if your head hasn't already hurt from dealing with it, you don't know what to do when you run into it. So whether that's, losing your children when you send them off to a school because you naively think, well, the schools have the best of intentions for our students, or whether it's sending them into the big city to work without preparation. I love it. I've heard people who, they're homeschooled, and the next thing they do is send them, they want to go work in New York City because they have some sort of weird illusion of what New York City is as a place to live. There were people in Alaska who also homeschooled, we'll say, from kind of a neo-hippie position. So they wanted their children to be more creative and more outgoing. So they would rather not get the conservative values of the school, because there were always, in Alaska anyway, conservative parents on the board who would squawk about some of the hyper-liberal things. And I remember some of those families would send their students off to the big world. And you could tell there was but just actually sending anyone from Alaska into the big world, it was a danger, because living in Alaska, you weren't really prepared for what you were going to run into, either in a school dormitory or on the streets of San Francisco, or, almost doing anything. You were prepared for bears, however. So you got to give credit to that, because there's a lot of people in the world who have no idea about the natural world, which is why many of those students would also return to Haines. Not all, but a lot. So what am I saying? L'Abri had a definite philosophical focus, not only to the heart of Christianity, but also to understanding what was going on in the world. And I wouldn't say my primary emphasis of this came from them, but I certainly found a place that was a kindred spirit to my own by that time, by the time I first went there. And I was so glad to find people who did care about music and did care about the arts and did care about the cultural changes in society and did care about the intellectual development and did care about these things. Now, they cared at different times in different ways, depending on who the workers were and depending on the questions of the students. But it was always a part of Schaeffer's mission at L'Abri to care about what was happening in the world. He started off in the 50s, and the first thing he did was dig into French existentialism. And they actually had some people at L'Abri who had spent time with Jean-Paul Sartre. You actually had people who had wrestled with these ideas on the ground. That makes a big difference. To get people, there was a teacher, Donald Drew, who would come in there and he would be teaching, he was coming in and teaching literary history from a Christian perspective. There was just a lot. There was, of course, the biggest one of all was Hans Ruckmacher, who regularly would just kind of walk in, plant some intellectual dynamite under the chairs and blow everyone's brains completely wide open. Because that's the way he did things. And it was, this is why I missed ever getting a chance to meet him. He died a year before I got there. The audacity and the sorrow. But But even when I was there in 78, 79, I was just scooping this information up. And I once talked to Dr. Schaefer, and I said, you know all that stuff you wrote in your books? I mean, if I boil down everything you wrote about music, because music was one of the most important things to me to try to understand. If I boiled down everything you wrote about music, I'd get a few pages. You didn't mean that as any sort of final statement, did you? And he goes like, oh, no, I'm not, absolutely not at all. Yeah, I meant it for people to start and then to go out and do the serious research. I said, okay, I got you. I'm on it. Because that's what's missing. People often form communes of various stripes, and they're saying things to themselves like, we want to live healthy lives. We want no distractions. We want to be safe and protected. And I'm sitting there going like, does any of this communal activity involve the brain, learning, intelligence? Because if it doesn't, it's not going to be a good commune. It's not going to be a good community if it doesn't allow open questions. And that's the key. Now, one of the other things Labrie did to solve the problems of putting two families under the same house was they had families always living in separate places. So that, there would be someone at Chalet Bordenette, and someone at Chalet Bethany, and someone at Beauseat, and someone at, there'd be someone at Bellevue, and all the different places had different familial groups or people within it. So that seemed to resolve that tension. And one of the things is during Labrie's heyday, they had multiple, Labrie wasn't just a building. They had multiple chalets that housed the students as well. And there was always workers, and often workers and their families, who lived in the same place. Now that was tough on them, to have the students there and the workers with their families as well. And they had to set up rules about on our days off, don't bother us kind of stuff. Because you see the tension here is between the personal, the individual and the group. If you're always in a group, you're in trouble. And if you're always alone, you're in trouble. So how do you form that tension? I would say Labrie did it as well as anybody. Eventually what they did was they put all the students pretty much in one building called Chalet Bellevue, when that was willed to Labrie. Very large chalet, formerly a retreat center for people who had cerebral palsy. And then it became Chalet Bellevue. And so the students all live on a couple of floors there, a very big chalet. And they also restricted the number of students from kind of an unruly amount that might creep up over 100 down to about 30, roughly. And that helped. One of the things I often thought, and I've talked to different people connected to Labrie about this, and I've got different feedback on this, but was that if Switzerland had allowed people to stay in the area, at that time we had 3-month window of opportunity. Don't tell anybody in Switzerland, but I stayed a lot longer than that because I figured out how to stay off the radar. And at that time, leaving a country, as it often is now, except I think the Schengen group is different. That big group in Europe that now lets you stay only 3 months in the whole zone. I much preferred you could stay 3 months here, 3 months in France, 3 months in Germany, to 3 months in all of these places collectively. But because Switzerland had these rules, people couldn't stay there, and it's actually a bit stricter today. And so that means that in order to get someone to stay there, either they have to have EU connections or Schengen group connections, more accurately, because Switzerland isn't in the EU, or they would have to have, what should we say? They would have to have get a visa that allowed them to stay, which the Swiss weren't just going to do for anyone. Unfortunately, my actual credentials are low. Doesn't matter how much I actually know. It matters, what I can produce officially. And I can't produce officially that much to show that Byrne learned anything in life. So I got YouTube videos. Does that count? No. But as a result, people had to leave the area unless they could find a way to stay in Switzerland. And my feeling is if that had not happened, the entire area would have been filled with former L'Abri students and their families, because I think that's how strong L'Abri was. And I don't think it would have worked as a commune or a cult. It would have worked more as you knew that there were people in your area who are part of this larger community. You see, that was the thing I realized, is that, one of the reasons, I went to New York. What can you say about community in New York? There ain't one. Now, I could say I was part of the artistic community or like I already mentioned, the Episcopalian Church, or I could talk about the music community or whatever, artistic musical community. But in fact, these weren't really communities either. They were people who came there with the same goals of making it, who were often really suspicious of each other. Not always. And near the end of my time in New York, I certainly did know a lot of people who hung out in the same circles. We'll say a community of people who have forgotten what a community is. That's what we'll say. Because the neighborhood structure in New York, which used to be the communities, had since fallen apart. And the rise in prices also did a lot. The gentrification did a lot to destroy communities. When the hip young things would move to the city, or the educated young things, the well-heeled young things would move to the city in order to make it, they would end up in various neighborhoods. And by showing up there, the realtors, getting greedy, as unfortunately many realtors do, keep jacking the prices up. And that jacking of the prices eventually destroys a community. It destroys the people who've been living there. It destroys the sense of the community, because those small little stores that had been able to function on a smaller amount of rent eventually can no longer afford to be there. So as I mentioned before, in Alaska, there were the remnants of community, I'll put it that way. Many of us were on the same page, though there was a major rift in the community. And it is largely connected to the cultural rift that has existed in America since the 60s. And that is the difference between the people who were with the new ideas, ex-post hippie, and the people who were in some way or another vaguely connected to the traditional ideas. And I use the word vaguely on purpose because so much has changed so that it's hard to tell. Now, the interesting thing in Alaska was you couldn't tell by looking what a person's political viewpoint was. And as a result, one treaded carefully before engaging in acts of political smearsmanship. Now, there were certain areas of the town where people all knew they were kind of on the same page. There was an area called Mud Bay where the majority of those people were in the, shall we say, back to the land liberal hippie fringe. You know, they had the usual left-wing opinions. Interestingly enough, I was coming from New York City, where the left-wing opinions were radically different than they were in this community in Alaska. These people were still living off the hippie vibes and the old school second wave feminist vibes. And, you know, they were still, listening to the Grateful Dead. That tells you everything you want to know. And what I had seen in New York was already the beginnings of the woke situation. Reading the writers of the Village Voice regularly, as I did in New York City, to understand what was coming down the pike, they were talking about all sorts of stuff that is now very common among the people who are the rather liberal types in the American sense of the word, as opposed to the actual sense of the word liberal originally, which had more to do with freedom and free speech. So, and interestingly now, my report, if you've seen any of my videos talking with my friend Ashley, the people on the left side are now no longer the back to the land hippies. They are the same people that I knew from the left in New York back in the 1990s. And that's how ideas spread. So they are fully behind all the changes in gender and education and all the kind of woke agenda. Whereas the other people, a motley group of different kinds of people who kind of rejected that. But some of the people who would have been in the liberal hippie fringe back in the 90s when I showed up in Alaska have also drifted rightwards, because many of those people, if you had just simply taken the New York City leftist from a Village Voice leftist from the 1990s and placed that person in Haines in the 1990s, that person would have seen most of those people as being much too conservative for them. So that is how things go. But there was still a good remnant of community. So, to this day, next time I go back to Alaska, I'm going to see lots of people I know. I'm going to go to the post office, and someone there is going to say, "How have you been, Bern?" I would go away on a expedition into Europe to go looking for puppets. I might be gone 2 months or 3 months. I would come back, and the people at the post office or the grocery store would always say, "How did your trip go, Bern?" That's part of a community. There were people there I could call up to help me with carpentry. I could call up people to help me get some stuff delivered to the trash. I would help them with different things. I remember going and helping a friend kill a goat once. There were people who, I taught people music history and film and media history because this is what I could do. I remember this pastor of this Presbyterian church when I first arrived in Alaska, the second year I was there. He knocked on the door one day and said, "Bern, I have something for you. Do you want a deer? I've been in Sitka and I got an extra deer that we shot. Would you like that?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And I had 4 people staying in my house with me, 2 of whom were vegetarians. We won't talk about the McDonald's meal they had on the way out from leaving McDonald's, but they were just like, "Oh, you killed a deer." The other 2 realized the special thing we were getting, and so the 3 of us had a good meal. But it was there were those aspects, so I was very attuned to life fishing. Fishing being a very traditional thing, even with new technological elements. There's certain aspects of it that are always the same. 1, you're on a boat. 2, the boat goes out and it gets dangerous. 3, you lose friends. And I lost at least 4 friends in fishing accidents and horrendous drownings and such. And this brings people together, actually, because this is our community. Also, I was friends with a lot of people who worked in nature, with doing tours and such. Some of them would only come for the summer, and there was a problem, I would say, with the people coming to work in the summer in tourism, bringing the spores of alienation with them. And this was one of the problems. I didn't have the answer to it. Why didn't more people in the local area work with tourism in the summer? But then again, the problem with that is, once the summer is over, we'll say by October, the tap for money is off, and those people need more money. So Alaska was good, and I often thought if I could be in a place, now where I lived in Haines, Alaska, you may be thinking really cold and such, but I would say think lower Scandinavia is much more like that, because I was in southeast Alaska, which, let's see, Alaska is kind of shaped, let me see if I can do this, kind of shaped like this, and this is southeast Alaska, and I lived right here up a fjord. This is the Arctic Ocean, this is the Bering Straits, this is the Aleutian Islands, Russia's over here, and by the way, some people say that the Russians want Alaska back. I've had people write that to me like, don't get too comfortable, the Russians are coming. I'm going like, the Russians couldn't cross the ocean and put a step on American soil without having something serious happen, regardless of who's president. Anyway, and then Fairbanks is like right here. What am I doing? Anyway, you get the idea. But I lived in really nice, the Scandinavian part of Alaska. And I felt a part of the community there. There was one thing that was really missing. I was trying to provide that myself. And that was a sense of an intellectual life. And the most you got is people listening to NPR, following the news, being propagandized one way or another, or else the other people watching television or whatever. And I mean, apart from what I was doing, there was very little intellectual stimulation there. And I think that's why I chose to move to Tbilisi, because I get a lot of intellectual stimulation here. Now, what's interesting about being in Tbilisi is it's another big city. Now, New York City works totally against community. In the regard that even when I had people visiting me and staying for several months in the area, eventually the interests of the city would just pull people apart. And people who I was really good friends with, I would only see now and then, because the city would pull them apart. The cities do that to people. I feel that same effect here, because it's a city. It's not nearly as big as New York, so it's not nearly as much of a problem. But the nice thing here is Tbilisi is small enough that when it comes to music, dance, the arts, I know so many people there. And if I don't know them, my friends know them. It's that simple. So it's much more of a sense. I'm going to a ballet next weekend, and my friend is the principal dancer there. And I know the person who runs the ballet troupe. That's my life here. That's what I was missing in Alaska, was artistic and intellectual pursuits. Because everything there was done, when there were presentations, it was all done on the level of a high school musical or something. And not a big high school. So I remember when I first arrived in Alaska, seeing the high school play version of the community theater version, we'll say it that way, because it wasn't just high school students, of Sound of Music. And it was on the level of, high school, almost grade school pageant of people holding up signs saying, "This is Austria." I mean, they weren't, but that's how, to me it felt coming from New York City. But what was interesting about that, it was so low on cultural stuff that when I started doing puppetry there, and really crazy puppetry to boot, based on my European wanderings, nobody knew that this wasn't standard American puppetry. Because it was like, okay, we'll do this crazy stuff. Burns inviting us to these crazy shows. And so we had some measure of success with our puppetry there. And it became part of the community. And that was very important. Now, I think by the time we're done with COVID, there was a huge, sad mudslide about a year ago there that really affected the community, and now just the tensions at large, both in America and in the world. Alas, I think our puppet troupe has had to, the remaining section of it, which was called Geppetto's Junkyard, hasn't done much for a long time, and that's just life. But meanwhile, I'm here and thinking of ways to bring people together. And I've seen some people express interest in regular get-togethers to discuss ideas and such. And that's an important thing. Plus, I'm getting more involved with my creative side here. And I've got an idea for a small film I want to make using these extremely talented creative people that I know. And the thing about Georgia is, ask yourself, how many Georgian films have you seen? How much Georgian art do you know about? Let alone the music and dance. That to me helps give possibilities. Unfortunately, there are also, the smartphone is here. Can't get away from it. And I would say one of the things about community in the future is we've got to deal with this problem. Now, interestingly enough, Labrie saw this coming with the laptop, and they created a policy for students when they come in, they have to check their laptops in. And they can only use them they can only use them at certain times. Now, they've since changed that a bit because as soon as they figured out this rule, because after all, if you're going someplace to learn, you are not going there to be connected to the whole world and to keep your propaganda bubble flowing and to, you're there to learn. You're not there to stay in touch with the world. And this is crucial. Also, since they've changed that, they've had to modify their use to include the smartphone, which has destroyed so much more. Whatever was left of community, pretty much destroyed by the smartphone, even in places like Haines. Anywhere you go, and you're at a restaurant, and you see people scrolling away and not talking to each other, you're in the presence of ghosts. The ghost of communities past. They at least are in the same building. I would much rather see people talking and arguing and singing and laughing together. And that's a subject for another day. But anyway, these are just a few of my thoughts about communities. So what we need, I don't think communes work very well. We need communities. But here's the thing. They have to be organic. So it doesn't do any good to simply, I think this is the problem with people going out to their own special, we buy like 100 acres in the middle of nowhere and start our community. No, you started a commune. You started, it has the makings of a cult. You started a place that's for protection. Whereas what I learned about Labrie is that it's a place where we are focused on answering questions. But in order to focus on answering questions and living in the world, you have to know what's going on in the world. This is one of the reasons I've appreciated Jordan Peterson, is because he functions as a gateway from the smaller worlds to the bigger world. And this is why Paul van der Klee's estuary idea is, I think, very important. And I think they all recognize this who take part in it. I don't, because I have problems, not that I couldn't, but I have problems dealing with, a multiple of people online at once. To me, it's much too abstract a concept. I'm sure some good questions can get resolved there, but I know where the real action takes place. It takes place in person. Just as I've had people writing very long comments to me under these videos. But I'll tell you, the longer your comments get, the more I'm going to ignore. You're going to see my comments get shorter and shorter, and then eventually I just won't answer, because that's not conversation. Conversation means you're in the presence of someone, you listen to what they're saying, and you can tell when the conversation is at its climax. So you can't have a real conversation here. Conversation is part of the goal of everything. Dialogue. It's the goal of art. Art is not just simply an act of self-will. It's part of a conversation. It's the goal of technology. Technology simply can't be to make yourself better and better and better. It has to be part of a conversation, and that conversation has to be a good one, and not a conversation inhibited or destroyed by technology. Our living situations, our architecture has to be about fostering human relationships, not inhibiting them. The modern apartment building inhibits conversation. The modern cul-de-sac in a suburb of a large city like Los Angeles inhibits conversation by making everyone circle around their car. YouTube should encourage conversation, not inhibit it. And I think those of us who've been wandering around these various sites where people are doing these things understand that. Some people just want to be stars, and I'm not talking about anyone in our immediate corner of the internet, but a little bit further off, but still kind of connected to what we're doing. You can tell they have an idea that they're becoming a YouTube sensation. But you're not. It doesn't matter if it doesn't happen in reality. And reality is not what's happening here. Reality is what's happening out there. Look, there's a real world out there. Look at my new, can you see it? Probably not. My new kumquat tree for the house. You didn't realize it had kumquat so far, did you? Okay, I'm out of here. I'm done. That was a bit of punishment. Remember, we're going against the stream. And the stream today, impersonal buildings, impersonal communication, impersonal community. Let's find the personhood within these things. Let's restore things. I'll have more ideas about how to do that as we go. But this is kind of a follow-up of sorts to my last video about culture. And one of the first things we have to do is figure out ways to do things together. Because if we do them alone, nothing's going to happen. Period. Take care. Droabit, which is the Georgian word for see you later, but what it really means is temporarily. We'll be away from each other temporarily. Droabit.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.